So welcome and thanks for joining in. So my name is Stephen Galbraith and I'm the chair of the first panel. And this is the Pacific Rim panel of people in the west coast of the US and Australia, New Zealand and Japan. So I'll introduce my panelists in the order that I see them on my screen. So I've got Dan Bonet here from Stanford, Kristen Lauter from Microsoft, giving a wave, Mehdi Tabuchi from NTT, and, great, Nadia Hinja from UCSD, and Yuvali Rom in Adelaide, Australia. Great. All right, so we've got a bit of a kind of overview of what's going on in elliptic curve cryptography, or at least that's the plan. So we've come up with some of the topics that we think are of interest or of some kind of novelty. And we thought we'd start off with discussion of attacks on signature schemes. So Yuval, can I get you to give us a little intro to attacks on signature schemes and what's been happening?
We have some attacks. The most publicity are a Minerva and TPM fail that show that basically extend the work of the old work of Bramlin to vary the timing attacks on ECDSA. They find the length of the nonce and from there use elasticity attack to recover the long-term key. And it is a bit surprising that in 2011 we still have this problem repeating. We've attacks. For example, there was an attack on a field inversion published in Chess 2020 that shows that getting the field inversion allows recovering the key. And there was the ladder leak in CCS, which two of the panelists were part of, and it shows that it improves the analysis of the case that we get very little information from the side channel. So, yeah, that's basically the ones I'm aware of.
So, Yuval, I have a question for you. So, with the ECDSA attack, many of the implementations use deterministic ECDSA, where you're not supposed to generate the nonce at random. Would that prevent these attacks?
It's a good question. First, these implementations indeed generated in random, but a deterministic nonce can still be short and can still leak. So if
a lot of this work at the beginning was seen as random. It was about bad randomness or failure of randomness, and now you're saying it's not really about randomness or whether things are random or not. It's really about constant time and side channel resistant implementations. So would you say the focus of where the problem has moved?
Can I jump in for a second? Or I think it's about it's a different threat model, right? So I guess we've seen that the whole structure of ECDSA and DSA and like all these North signatures, like because they have a nice linear relationship with the nonce and the private key, they just open themselves to all sorts of fun attacks. And so you've got randomness issues, you've got people who just implement them wrong, you've got the slight differences in the length of the hash versus the length of your group order that cause a small bias that are exploitable. And so like as you implement one defense, like deterministic nonces, which fixes some of these issues, like the bad randomness issues, then you open the door to new attacks. And so I think from an implementer's point of view, it's hard to choose one countermeasure over another in like balancing threat models. And so like as cryptographers, we want to sort of remove any of these choices that implementers have to make. And it seems like in this case, we want to have deterministic nonces and like formally verified code that's like constant time. And then you remove all the issues from implementation.
I just realized, by the way, that we should probably explain what deterministic nonces are. Yeah. So does anybody want to jump in and just say, well, maybe I'll say it. So deterministic nonces is where the nonce is actually derived via some sort of a pseudo-random function from the message. So you don't use a random number. You don't use a random generator to generate the nonce, but you derive it secretly from the message, and then you can make sure that it's properly distributed and so on. But like Mehdi said, it could still be short, and so the attack would still apply. I guess the issue is if you sign the same message twice, you'll end up using the same nonce twice. Yeah.
I see we're having some problems with the YouTube stream. So anyway, I guess we'll carry on and hope that someone is catching some of it. Otherwise, it's an enjoyable conversation for us.
Ourselves, great.
I mean, Nadia, do you want to also add a bit about how some of this has come up in cryptocurrencies and some of the interesting situations you've noticed?
So yeah, you're referring to my paper with Joachim Breitner a couple of years ago, where we basically just aimed a super trivial lattice attack. So like, kind of a 3x3 lattice at all of the signatures that we could find from the Bitcoin blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, and then like scans of SSH and TLS, just looking for people who were generating their nonces so poorly that they were, say, half the length that they were supposed to be, so that we had like a huge number of leading zeros that would let us carry out a key recovery attack, and found a small but non-zero number of vulnerable implementations that just made plain mistakes. They were repeating the same bits over and over again to generate their nonces. They had random number generation vulnerabilities. They just chose the wrong length of nonce, and there were some that seemed to have memory safety vulnerabilities where they were like overriding part of the nonce with other values.
So I guess the lesson is it's hard to write code. Apparently.
It is hard to write code, especially for something like this where it's a perfectly valid signature. It validates. So security is different from sort of correctness, and it's hard to validate for security, I guess, which is why we need to go back to having formally verified implementations.
And with your scan, you actually recover the corresponding signing key, right? Mm-hmm. So you could actually just take the Bitcoin if you wanted.
There was very little Bitcoin. And in a lot of cases, people have been scanning the Bitcoin blockchain for repeated nonces for many years and stealing all of those Bitcoins, and then somebody has made a lot of money off of that. It was not worth it for us to take the very small amount of money that we found.
Yeah, a good story.
There's BLS, right? There are other ways of doing signatures. Sign. Is this actually a dead end and we should be designing different signature schemes?
Ooh, I don't know if it's, in some sense, RSA signatures seem to have done better in terms of implementation vulnerabilities. They're much less fun to attack from a side channel point of view. The only thing that you can do is the modular exponentiation, and you have to do the full. You have to attack the full exponent, or almost, enough of the exponent to recover it, as opposed to ECDSA. So,
as Dan
back to and I don't know. I've spent less time looking at BLS signatures just because there's fewer people using them. So it might be a more fun target once there's more actual implementations of them.
So for those who don't know, there's Bonnet and Shahan signatures, and this pairing based. And the original selling point was that they were short. You'd probably have to revisit that according to current security levels, but they're certainly practical. And
there's no randomness, and the point is that you can aggregate many of them. You can compress many of them into a single signature.
And I think there's a much tighter security proof as well. So there's lots of good features about BLS signatures. So, Is that what we should be using? Get rid of ECDSA.
Well, we're getting rid of ECDSA soon anyway, right?
You mean moving to Schnorr?
Or moving to post-quantum. or 3072-bit RSA.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think we'll move on to our next topic. Hopefully, some of this, if not live streamed, is at least recorded and people can enjoy subsequently. So let's maintain the illusion that we're broadcasting. Dan, do you want to tell us something about the things you've been working on and paying attention to?
Sure. So since this is ECC, I guess I wanted to mention this question of groups of unknown order. So the traditional groups of unknown order, of course, are the ones that are derived from RSA. Take two prime numbers, multiply them, and since nobody can factor, presumably, then you get a group of unknown order. The problem, of course, is that requires what's called a trusted setup. Somebody has to choose the primes, multiply them, and that gives a group of unknown order. So the question is, can we have a group of unknown order without a trusted setup? So the first solution that comes to mind is just choose a large enough random number and hope that that random number has two large prime factors, and as a result, nobody can factor. The problem is you have to choose a really big, large number for that to be secure, something like over 60,000 bits or so. Otherwise, it's just unlikely to be difficult to factor. So that's not a good solution for building a group of unknown order without a trusted setup. The amazing thing is that we do have we used to have only one other candidate, which is class groups. And if you think about class groups for just a minute, these are class groups of quadratic imaginary orders. It's kind of remarkable that all you do is you specify the discriminant of the extension of the class group, and just the discriminant, the prime discriminant, determines a group, and nobody can calculate the order of the group efficiently if the discriminant is sufficiently big. Right, the best algorithms are sub-exponential, and so if the discriminant is sufficiently big, nobody can calculate the order of that group. So that's amazing, right? I mean, literally, you just have one parameter, and you end up with a group of unknown order. The problem, unfortunately, is that you have to still use a fairly large prime. I guess there's some debate as to how large, but let's just say a 1500-bit prime would be an example of that. And the class group operation, as you know, you have to compose forms, you have to reduce forms. It's slow. Yeah, the problem is the group operation is not as fast as we'd like. So this was a big question. Like we really need groups of unknown order. They're useful for accumulators. They're useful for verifiable delay functions. They're useful for vector commitments. They have quite a few applications that people want to deploy. So we really do need groups of unknown order. Except the only ones we had were these class groups, and they were kind of slow. And so the question was, can we build another one? And we were really happy. Like Dobson, Stephen Galbraith, and Ben Smith published this really cool paper. Everybody should read this paper. It's a really, really cool paper that makes, I'd say, a pretty bold suggestion, right? And the suggestion is, I guess it comes from the observation that even though we have polynomial time algorithms for counting points on curves of genus, hyperelliptic curves of genus 2 or 3, these algorithms are not very fast. So in particular, we can kind of set the parameters so that Scoff's variance of Scoff's algorithm run in time 2 to the 128, and as a result, counting the number of points on these curves, it becomes infeasible. Yeah, so the proposal, I guess Stephen should say more about this, but the proposal is choose a genus 3 curve, say, large enough prime, and the claim is that no one can count the number of points on that curve if the curve is set correctly. Yeah, and so boom, we have a cool group of unknown order, and apparently, it is faster than the corresponding class group. Yeah, so that's kind of amazing. Yeah, there's one issue there which I think raises really interesting problems, which is now all of a sudden we do have a polynomial time algorithm for this problem. We can count the size of the number of points in polynomial time using Scoff's algorithm. What is it? The algorithm runs in time p to the, I forget the exponent, p to the 10 or 12. Do you remember, Stephen? There's some crazy exponent.
No, don't remember, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a large exponent, which is why we can achieve 2 to the 128 security. But it is a polynomial time algorithm. So it's very different from traditional cryptography, right? Traditional cryptography, if somebody comes up with a factoring algorithm that's like, 10 times faster than the traditional factoring algorithm, all we have to do is just increase the size of the modulus by, 3 bits. Or maybe I should use elliptic curves. If somebody comes up with a discrete log algorithm on elliptic curves that's 10 times faster, in the normal, we would just increase the size of the curve by 3 bits, and that would compensate. Here, because there's a polynomial time algorithm, if somebody speeds up that algorithm by a factor of 10, it's actually much harder to compensate, right? We would have to go to a much larger prime. So it's kind of an unusual property for a crypto system that we're really dependent on the precise security of the point counting algorithm. It's kind of interesting. It's related to an area of crypto called fine-grained crypto, where we kind of make very precise assumptions about the polynomial exponents for solving the problem. And so, A, it's pretty fascinating that there's a new candidate for a group of unknown order. B, I thought, honestly, this was published a couple of months ago, and I thought this would actually revive the need for faster algorithms for counting points on genus 3 curves. Yeah, so this is like a typical ECC topic, right? Can we come up with better algorithms for counting points on genus 3 curves? That would break this proposal, but would be good to know if it's safe or not. So we're not just looking for asymptotic improvements. Now, all of a sudden, the game is, what are the exact constants for the running time of these algorithms, right? Even a factor of 100 improvement that's not asymptotically improving the exponent would have a huge impact on the security of these schemes. So that's kind of one fascinating question that comes from this. And then the other fascinating question is, I think the race is still on. Like, are there other groups of unknown order, right? Are there other algebraic structures? There are so many algebraic structures out there, right? Are there other algebraic structures where you can just specify the invariance of the structure, and that would specify a structure on which no one can count the number of points on the resulting group? Yeah, I think that's still a beautiful, beautiful open problem. And again, I want to reemphasize, we really need these things, right? If we had something, a structure where the group operation was as fast as RSA, that would be a big deal. Yeah, there are people waiting to use this stuff. So yeah, we really do need it. And so I think there's a lot of room for more research in this area. So maybe before I move on to another topic, why don't I keep quiet and let people react?
Well, thanks, Dan. I'll make a couple of little additional remarks. First, as the paper's not published, it's still kind of a work in progress. So we're very happy to get feedback on the paper if anyone's interested. And in particular, we've precisely understanding what security should mean has been vexing us greatly, and so that would be good. Oh, we've lost Dan. The other thing I wanted to mention is that it's from an algorithmic point of view, there's something really interesting going on, because there's 3 different types of algorithm we're fighting against. There's Scope type algorithms, which count points in a very obvious way. There's algorithms to solve the discrete log problem, which can be used as point counting methods. So you can take work by Dean, for example, on solving discrete logs on genus 3 curves, and that can be turned into point counting algorithms. And then there's this algorithm by Drew Sutherland, which is really a parameterized family of algorithms, and in certain cases that works very well. So we've got this weird sort of dynamic where we've got a point counting problem which can be tackled by Scope algorithms, by index calculus algorithms, by Sutherland's algorithm, and you're kind of trying to find where is the space in which is sort of resists all these different approaches, and that's why genus 3 seemed to come up as a bit of a sweet spot. If you go for higher genus, then the index calculus algorithms start to dominate. But the other thing I wanted to comment on is really the reason why genus 3 is better than class groups is partly because of compression, because we don't have a good means of compressing elements of class groups, whereas we have point compression or divisor compression for genus 3. So the kind of unexpected aspect of the story was that it kind of, at the end of the day, it came down to the question of the size of representations of group elements. So that's why genus 3 hyperelliptic curves are great, because we can represent group elements with a kind of minimal size representation.
Probably worth mentioning also, it's worth mentioning also that there's a really cool trick in your paper for slightly compressing class group representation. Also, very, very, very cute trick.
Yeah, but it could have been invented at any time, right? That could have been invented 20 years ago.
Yeah, I guess it's related to RSA signature compression.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Anyhow, I really hope somebody in the audience has some great idea for other groups of unknown order. It's such an easy problem to state, right? Just specify an invariant. The corresponding group should have unknown order. That's it.
There's a question from Chloe in the Zulip saying, should you avoid special curves like CM curves? And yes, the answer is yes. You should absolutely. I mean, another good question will be to work out sort of how. There's actually a paper on this already that talks about some of the special cases you would want to avoid. You shouldn't have CM or real multiplication. These very special cases you'd want to avoid. And you probably also want to make sure not only are you not a special case, but you're not close to a special case by isogeny. So there's some work to be done to kind of work out if you really choose a random genus 3 curve by some means, are you sure that you're not a special case where point counting is easy or isogeny close under a short isogeny to that? So that's a good problem too. Thanks, Chloe. Midi.
You're muted, Midi.
Yeah, sorry. So does this open up the issue of, I mean, depending on the trusted setup, it might not, but so it's well known that when we have a small set of curves that are easier to attack, we have this old, I think, Teske problem of having, what they call key escrow, the key escrow setting, where you know that you have this weak curves, and then you take some secret isogeny walk and publish the resulting curve and have something that appears to be strong, but can be broken by this person who knows the secret isogeny path.
Yeah, you're muted again. But actually, I think I can answer that. So, so the group itself is going to be determined by some invariants. Yeah. You guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So the group itself is going to be determined by some invariants, yeah? And the question is, where do these invariants come from? And typically in applications, either the invariants are generated by, by some trusted source of entropy, potentially like a large group of participants, or often in the, in many of the blockchain applications, the invariants are generated by like, a previous block or so. So the attacker actually you make a really good point, but in a lot of these systems, the attacker actually doesn't control how the invariants are generated. Yeah, so they are generated by some random process, and that's absolutely necessary. It's a good point.
Dan, do you want to carry on with them?
Actually, I have other things I wanted to discuss, but actually maybe we should go around and let other people talk, and we can come back to me in a bit. Does that work?
Does anyone want to talk?
Sure. Well, so Stephen, you had asked me to talk a little bit about post-quantum crypto, I think, unless there was some other topic you wanted me to cover.
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm aware that we have another panel on this, so, but I think it's certainly very much relevant.
So, in the post-quantum space, I mean, I'm most interested in kind of three different types of candidates: the code-based crypto and the lattice-based crypto. Graph. This is supposed to be focused mostly on elliptic curve crypto. I thought I should make most of my comments on the supersingular isogeny graph topic. I mean, the lattice-based crypto is a super attractive candidate for post-quantum crypto because it also allows for homomorphic encryption, which I think opens up a lot of possibilities for confidential compute. So I think the lattice-based crypto is a really promising direction for post-quantum crypto. And so supersingular isogeny graphs are, only in the third round as kind of an alternate candidate in the third round of the NIST post-quantum crypto competition. But I still think in the long term they'll probably be pretty interesting. So with my co-authors, Eyal Goren and Dennis Charles, we introduced supersingular isogeny graphs into crypto in 2005. So that's now fully 15 years ago. So that's fairly mature compared to, when I first started working on it, obviously. When I first joined Microsoft in 2000, elliptic curve cryptography was 15 years old. So it's a familiar feeling. And so I think, the hard problem for those that are not familiar with it is that instead of having a discrete logarithm problem on an elliptic curve, you have a large graph, which is specified by the choice of a large prime, and the points in the graph are supersingular isomorphism classes of supersingular elliptic curves, and the edges in the graph are isogenies between them. So originally, when we proposed this in 2005 at the NIST hash function competition, we actually specified a couple of things which are not now really considered as part of the conditions. And so it's kind of interesting to see what kind of weaknesses you can get without those conditions. So initially we proposed, of course, P congruent to 1 mod 12 so that you would, so that these graphs are actually Ramanujan graphs, which are optimal expander graphs. And, the hard problem in the area is finding paths in these graphs. So if you have two elliptic curves or two isomorphism classes, the hard problem is to find a path between them. But so the Ramanujan property makes them kind of optimal expanders in the sense that as you walk around the graph, if you take a long enough walk, if you take a walk of length roughly log p, then you get to a uniformly distributed point in the graph, roughly uniformly distributed. So the interesting thing is that in the more recent applications, such as Psych, which is the key exchange, you have two isogeny graphs and three isogeny graphs typically, but the walks are only half log p. So that's kind of an interesting, I always think that's a very interesting feature to think about, is that it's a little bit special in that sense. So most points, if you take two random points in the graph, it's very unlikely that there will be a path of length half log p between them. So the other thing that we suggested initially was that you should put additional congruence conditions on the prime to avoid having any short cycles in the graph. So it's not clear that being able to find short cycles will do, very much towards attacking Psych. But it is kind of interesting, and Dan, with his co-author, had a new paper this year about the distribution of short cycles in these graphs. But if you impose the conditions that we originally suggested, you impose congruence conditions on the prime, and there are simply no short cycles in the graph. So that also it seems like a good thing to consider whether we should stick to that type of condition. So I consider the main avenue for attacking supersingular isogeny graphs to be kind of the original approach in the paper, paper with Cole and Petit and Tignol, which essentially is able to find paths fairly efficiently if you think of the graph instead of as a graph of supersingular elliptic curves, but rather the nodes are maximal orders in a quaternion algebra. They're roughly efficient to attack on the problem. And so that leads to the 2018 Eurocrypt paper with Petit and Eisentrager and Hallgren and Morrison spells out exactly the fact that the weakness of the supersingular isogeny graphs is essentially equivalent to the endomorphism ring finding problem, which associates with a supersingular elliptic curve its maximal order in a quaternion algebra. So that's kind of like the problem to attack, and which is of course related to being able to find cycles, cycles in the graph. And if there are no small cycles, you're stuck with finding big cycles. But if in fact there are short cycles and they may be easier to find, that could be one potential way of attacking the general problem. So that's kind of my view of the status quo on that.
Kristen, maybe it's worth adding also the bandwidth benefits of isogeny-based key exchange compared to other post-quantum key exchanges.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, so being able to take a prime which is relatively small, like it's on the order of the size of elliptic curve crypto, in the hundreds of bits. So for the hash function, we only had to take 250 bits, but if you're 500 to 750 bits, something like that, then that's much smaller than a J invariant, which is just an FP squared, is much smaller than the key sizes for the lattice-based crypto in particular and the code-based crypto. So I assume that's what you're referring to.
Yeah. And I'd say that still, in my mind, the biggest open problem in the supersingular isogeny space is coming up with a short signature scheme. Unfortunately, the signature schemes in the space are still quite large. So whoever solves that problem, short signatures from supersingular isogenies, that'll be pretty cool.
Yeah, so Stephen, maybe you want to comment on that since you have a couple of papers in that direction.
Yeah, you mean that I've failed that I've failed to solve Dan's problem? Yeah, thanks. The really frustrating thing about isogenies is that in some ways they're so analogous to discrete logs, and they're so analogous to Diffie-Hellman. I mean, the Giaudefeo is close to Diffie-Hellman, and Seaside is really just like Diffie-Hellman. But because it's still only a group action at best, you just don't have this kind of rich algebraic structures. So everything we were talking about at the beginning about ECDSA and this nice linear equation that makes side channel attacks so powerful, well, we don't have it, because that's also what makes the signatures so good. My conjecture, which is based on no mathematics, is that somehow the failure to have a good signature scheme is also somehow linked to the reason why it might be post-quantum secure. So my conjecture is that anything with a really beautiful, elegant algebraic structure that allows you to make efficient signatures, then bam, you've got Shor's algorithm, and you're not post-quantum. So that's Galbraith's conjecture, which is even more implausible than genus 3 curves being hard to count points.
Christian, do you have any inside knowledge of why it was made into the alternate in the NIST process?
Oh, I have no inside knowledge whatsoever.
Maybe Stephen or Nadia or Yuval? Okay, I guess it was kind of a bit of a black box.
Is this the part where we start with the conspiracy theories?
No, that's not it.
That's the meeting room afterwards. That's the coffee room. We're all anonymous avatars.
Yeah.
Tanya's put a nice line on the Zulip, framing my statement. She says, "Schnorr implies Shor," and that is beautiful. He's won the comment of the year. We haven't had much from the audience. Does anyone got anything they want to? We've got a reasonable number of people actually on the blue button at this point, either on the chat or on the Zulip. If anyone wants to post anything. Yeah, I mean, back to your question, Dan, about NIST. I would guess, even though, as Kristen said, 15 years is a long time, I guess they're just a little bit nervous about the security.
Potentially, yeah. If there are no questions, I can talk a little bit about new developments in ECC as being used for polynomial commitments.
Sure.
No, there's a question. Matthew.
Okay, so I think what's the advantage? I think the comment is it was good for key exchange. So the public keys are short, and the messages are short for key exchange. I think that's what you were saying, right, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the way to think about it is if you are doing a key exchange with our Musk colony on Mars, maybe you want to minimize the number of bits you're sending back and forth, and so this is basically the cyc results in much shorter in shorter messages than other post-quantum schemes. The downside is, even though the messages are short, the computation is actually quite heavy. So if you're on a very slow network, this is a worthwhile trade-off. But if the network is like a normal network that runs pretty fast, then the trade-off is actually pretty expensive.
Yeah, and Ben Smith has pointed out that key sign, which is to be presented at AsiaCrypt, it's an isogeny-based signature scheme, and its signatures are pretty short because they've solved the challenge size problem. And it's based on the endomorphism ring computations and quaternion algebras like Kristen was talking about. So that's a very cool paper.
But it's not as short as the Schnorr signatures, yeah?
No, and it's pretty slow as well because you've still got to, I mean, it's a very cool paper, but it's you'd also like something that is a little faster, ideally.
Yeah, but also to be fair, I mean, the computations for supersingular isogeny graphs are not as efficient as, lattices and, I think code-based crypto, but still, I mean, they're on par with elliptic curve crypto, and we've been, dealing with elliptic curve crypto for forever. So, I mean, that was actually the reason that we didn't develop a formal submission to the hash, to the NIST hash function competition based on supersingular isogeny graphs, because, for a hash function, you want something that's way faster than elliptic curve crypto. But in general, for key exchange, I mean, we tolerate that level of performance for, using ECC today. So I don't see that as being a big difference. And of course, there are hardware accelerations. So I think I see Reza on the call here, who's done a lot of good work on, hardware accelerations for the isogeny scheme. So I think the performance is not really I don't think performance would be the reason that it would not be in the final candidates.
Tanya's asked a question about okay. I think Tanya's question preempts yours, Dan. So why don't you do your talk and then we can come on to Tanya's question.
Oh, about polynomial commitments?
Yeah.
All right, short rant. By the way, apologies for my being dark. Somehow the sun set and it became dark here, and I'm sitting outside. So I'm camping out. It's pretty interesting. Let's see. So polynomial commitments. I imagine many of the folks in the audience know what they are. Basically, given a polynomial, you'd like to be able to commit a univariate polynomial of degree up to some bound d. You'd like to be able to commit to that polynomial. So the commitment that comes out of the scheme is a short commitment to a polynomial. And later on, given a value, given x and y, you want to be able to convince a verifier that the committed polynomial at the point x evaluates to y. Yeah, and the evaluation protocol also has to be short and very fast. So that's called a polynomial commitment scheme. And these things are super, super useful. There are so many things that it's kind of amazing. There's so many things you can build with polynomial commitment schemes. One of the more exciting ones is that polynomial commitment schemes give you snarks. Yeah, so they give you these very succinct, non-interactive arguments of knowledge. That's why polynomial commitments became so important. But there are lots and lots of things you can do with polynomial commitments. So the classic polynomial commitment scheme is actually using pairings. It's called the KGZ commitment scheme. I guess it's from 2011, I think. And it's actually really easy to describe. So I give you a polynomial f, basically we're going to fix a base point p, and we're going to choose a random secret alpha. And the commitment to the polynomial is simply f of alpha times p. Yeah, that's it. Boom. So it's a really, really simple commitment. The question is just where does this alpha live, the secret alpha? And alpha basically lives in what's called a structured reference string, a public string that's made up of a sequence of elements that look like p, alpha squared p, alpha cubed p, up to alpha to the dp. Yeah, so the reference string is of size d. It's got d or d plus 1 elements in it. So that has to be generated somehow. So that requires a trusted setup to generate that. Everybody has to store that value. So that's quite a lot of data that everybody has to store. But once that's set up, the commitment is trivial. Like I said, it's just f of alpha times p. That's it. That's the whole commitment. And then there's a really cute opening protocol. So I can open the polynomial at any given point that I want. And is just basically one pairing computation. That's it. So very, very fast verification and very, very simple opening. So one of the problems, so this is 2011. Why are we discussing this in ECC 2020? Well, there's been interesting progress recently. So for a long time, the size of the size of the reference string was linear in the degree of the polynomial. And it was always fascinating, like, could we actually shrink the degree of the reference string? And finally this year, there's a paper by actually one of my students, Benedict Bunz, and Mary Mahler, and Mishra, and Vesley, which is a beautiful, beautiful paper.
US and really Australia, New Zealand, and
where
Japan.
What they do, there's a lot of results in the paper, but the results that I'll highlight basically is a result that's comparable to the KGZ scheme, except that the reference string now shrinks to square root of d size. Yeah, square root of d size. Now that doesn't come for free. Because the reference string shrinks to square root of d size, the evaluation proof becomes logarithmic in the degree. Before, the evaluation proof was constant. Now it becomes logarithmic. So it's a little bit bigger, still quite short, but there's a pretty significant win in the reference string size. So that's a pretty cute performance improvement in the polynomial commitments. And literally, just very, very recently, there was a further improvement called just like in the last 2 weeks or so. That's another paper that's really worth reading. Very cute idea in that paper that actually further improves things, but that actually has good implications to snarks and such. But I'm going to let you read the paper for yourself. Yeah, so there's kind of interesting progress in using pairings for polynomial commitments.
Cool. So the question that Tanya posted to Zulab was really around post-quantum, because obviously pairing-based crypto, or elliptical crypto is not post-quantum. Yeah, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so there are other families of polynomial commitment schemes that actually are post-quantum secure. So the most common one is what's called FRI, so based on Reed-Solomon proofs, Reed-Solomon proximity proofs, and those are basically polynomial commitments that come from hash functions. They're just based on hash functions, but the evaluation proofs are not as short as the algebraic methods. Yeah, and so we do have actually things that are post-quantum secure. There's just right now there's a little bit of a cost in using them. Asymptotically, though, they're fantastic. Yeah, just concretely, there are some constants that are involved, but those, again, beautiful, beautiful constructions. And generally, if anybody's interested in getting into the world of snarks, I highly recommend kind of learning about polynomial commitments. It's really quite a pretty area. Yeah, there are now 4 families of polynomial commitments. Maybe I'll just say the names so people can kind of know what to look up. Yeah, so I already mentioned the KGZ polynomial commitment. That's the classic one, based on pairings. There's the bulletproof one, the bulletproof polynomial commitment, which is just based on discrete log. It generates very short evaluation proofs. The downside of bulletproofs, like if we have bulletproofs, why do we need the pairing-based systems? The downside of bulletproofs is that the verifier actually runs in linear time in the degree, whereas in the KGZ, the verifier is independent of the degree. Yeah. Although that still turns out to imply a snark. Yeah. So for practical applications, efficiency doesn't really matter so much. So we said KGZ, bulletproofs, the FRI-based methods, and then the third one is called DARK, D-A-R-K, which is based on class groups and groups of unknown order. And the nice thing about the class group method is this is a way to basically build a polynomial commitment scheme that also doesn't require a trusted setup. Yeah, and so we get efficient verification, short proofs, and doesn't require a trusted setup from these class group systems. But of course, that's not quantum secure. Yeah, so the only one that's currently quantum secure is the FRI methods. Yeah, so more work to do there.
Great. I thought we're running out of time, and we've got a few generic questions, but I thought it would be quite nice to touch on this last topic of the computational records, and it's kind of notable that it's been a long time since anyone solved an elliptic curve discrete log challenge, though I actually only recently learned about, only when I looked at Wikipedia today, that there was actually a pollard kangaroo computation that was pretty cool, 114-bit discrete log in an interval that was solved by the kangaroo method, and that was some blockchain-related challenge problem. But in general, in terms of progress on ECDLP algorithms, we're still around the 110, 115-bit range for problems, and yet there's been factoring in discrete log records coming regularly, including a couple of big factoring records in the last few years. So Nadia, you've been involved in that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about why there's progress in discrete log and RSA on factoring, but not elliptic curves?
In some sense, it's probably good news for elliptic curves because the progress from factoring in discrete log is exploiting the algebraic structure of these problems. And so no news for elliptic curves may be good news in some sense. I mean, there's been kind of two directions of records, right? There was an announcement of a 750-bit binary field discrete log from Granger et al. Earlier this year, and that was, I guess, following up on the previous asymptotic improvements from, I guess, 2013 for small characteristic discrete log, and that is kind of, I guess, putting the nail in the coffin for all of for those fields for cryptography. And so that's like a big record, and they had a bunch of computational improvements that they put together to get this new record, like avoiding expensive Grosvenor basis calculations. With the 795-bit factoring in discrete log and the 830-bit factoring record that I did with Budo, Gaudry, Giewick, Tomei, and Zimmerman, there were a bunch of There were a variety of improvements that were included. An interesting one is using batch smoothness detection in the sieving phase for the number field sieve. So this is an idea from Dan Bernstein from many years ago that hasn't really been used in these large computations before, where you do, if you're trying to detect whether the many candidate numbers that you're sieving for smoothness are smooth, and you can do a batch GCD computation to test a large number of them at once. And so there's, and this is kind of the first time that it seems to have provided a real benefit. And then the other sort of thing that, most of the work was my co-authors were doing was doing a lot of simulation to find optimal parameters. Because the number field sieve is such a complex algorithm, there's a bunch of different parameters that you can tune to adjust the expense of different stages. Like you have the polynomial selection phase, you have the sieving phase, you have the linear algebra phase, and then for discrete log you have like the final discrete log computation phase. And you can adjust the difficulty of sieving versus linear algebra, for example. So one of the contributions of this paper was doing all of these measurements and simulations to try to exactly predict the cost of all of these phases beforehand in order to like know exactly how many resources to devote to them and to like minimize the total time. And I have never done anything sophisticated with elliptic curve discrete log, but my understanding is that these like our understanding of these algorithms is much simpler. The improvements are implemented on an FPGA, implemented on a GPU, like do faster curve operations, like shave off cycles from your curve operations when you're doing these things, and then dump a bunch of hardware at it. And the hardware is going to be obsolete in a few years, and there's not that many things that you can do with like a room full of GPUs. Whereas with kind of these large like discrete log and factoring records, they're being carried out on clusters like supercomputers, and you can just get time, especially if you're European and at an INRIA and you have access to these things. You have a pool of computing resources that you can use, and you don't have to like buy $1 million of hardware every time you want to do a new computation. So that's kind of my understanding. I don't know if like maybe there's something big that everybody's missing, but until we have like effective index calculus or something more complicated than Pollard row or Kangaroo for discrete log, it seems like for elliptic curve discrete log, it seems like the improvements are mostly just going to be like pouring more hardware into the problem.
Cool. Any other comments from the panelists on these matters?
That's actually good news, isn't it? That there's no progress on these on breaking these things. Good news for once.
Good news, or it just may mean that it's not low-hanging fruit enough, and so some entities who are more motivated than public researchers may have more interesting things to say than we do.
I think the biggest risk, I suppose, with anything in terms of research is that it becomes a problem just becomes so hard to make any new progress on that nobody looks at it at all. So I think there's a risk that discrete log, I mean, people say that about factoring, right? That nobody works on factoring, but in fact, you've literally just told us that people are working on factoring. Whereas like nobody works
people who are working on it, right? I mean, I think this isn't well understood outside of the cryptography community, that there's like a very, very small number of people who are doing this seriously, and we know all of them. And people think, oh, there's billions of dollars writing on this. It must be a super well-studied subject to death. But the fact that, in 2013, that there was this massive asymptotic improvement in the small characteristic discrete log that just everybody had been missing for decades. And then suddenly, if that were to happen for large characteristic, then we would be in trouble, right? And I don't see any fundamental reason why there can't be an L of 1/4 like prime field discrete log algorithm.
Forget L of 1/4. How about a fourth root of P algorithm? That would be right. With elliptic curves, why not cube root of the order? Is there anything fundamental about square root?
Well, and it also could be that, elliptic curve has long history now where there were a lot of weak choices that were discovered in the beginning. So, first the proposal to use super singular elliptic curves, and that was weak. And then, other, using curves over, fields of order like, 2 to the n, where n was composite, that was weak. So there were a lot of different weak things that were discovered that are easy to avoid, right? So then now we have, various standard choices, and we don't have any like obviously really weak things to go after. Whereas the quantum algorithms are a little bit more attractive to dig into, because we're, close enough to, like, if we could have a quantum computer big enough, it's really worthwhile, looking at the exact, attack times for quantum on elliptic curve. So maybe it could just be a small difference in the trade-off. So what's the low-hanging fruit here? The quantum attack looks a little bit more low-hanging.
Well, Tanya said we can go a little over if we want, but I'm aware that people will probably be nearly ready for the coffee break or something. Dan Bernstein's got a question though in the Zulip that I'll ask. Why are we putting so much effort into fancy crypto when we don't even seem to be able to encrypt or sign properly? So I'll let each of the panelists in turn have an answer to that question.
Oh boy.
You can start, Dan.
Are you serious? I see. Yeah, well, what can I say? It's a good question. I think maybe the answer is because, or maybe part of the answer is because there's demand, right? I mean, encrypting and signing only gets us part of the way. How do you maybe give some simple examples, but like maybe go to one example, like how do you implement Zcash just with encrypting and signing? So there's demand, and that actually obviously drives the interest in these constructions. But also, what can I say? They're also very pretty, so it's also fun to just think about these problems. Maybe I'll just leave it.
Kristen, is Microsoft interested in more than just signing and encryption?
Well, it depends on what you mean by fancy. So, of course, I took the attack as being directed at me, working on homomorphic encryption, which I don't necessarily think of as fancy, but I do think of it as an important functionality that's important to try to enable. So that's why I work on it.
Mehdi?
So recently I was talking with a colleague who is a much more theoretical cryptographer than I am, who was saying that so now we have a very credible candidate for indistinguishability obfuscation construction. So therefore, cryptography was over. And so of course that's an interesting perspective. So probably this means that now that the theoretical problems are kind of solved in one go, we can all go back to doing simple stuff and making it efficient, maybe. So you can see this as a sign of hope.
We did talk about saying outrageous things in the panel, so thank you, Mehdi. Yuval.
Well, I am not so good about fancy crypto. I leave that for people who are much smarter than me. I'm still focusing on the encrypting and signing or breaking the encryption signatures. So I don't know.
Nadia.
I guess I'm also in sort of Camp Yuval, where I think it's safe for the community to be putting effort into fancy crypto because in order to keep cryptanalysts employed, we need to have more targets, right? You can't keep publishing the same papers about the same attacks over and over again. We need to have new structures to attack in the future, and we need to deploy this stuff in order to actually publish these papers in the more applied venues. Because right now attacks against the more theoretical constructions can only be in the more theoretical venues. So in terms of like safety of the community and employment for all of us, I think it's a good idea. But more seriously, I mean, you have to, from the perspective, I mean, is it safe to eat fine cuisine when there are people starving in the world? Like sort of, as human beings, we have sort of a diversity of our civilization and culture, and so we have to have the high bits and the low bits, and people focusing on all of them.
I think we're all in agreement that we should keep working on encrypting and signing. That's pretty important.
Yes, yeah. Awesome. Thank you all to the panelists for taking part, and the audience, which is got reasonably large, I'm happy to say, and hopefully subsequently people will be able to see this on YouTube. So thanks for coming along. Anyone got any last? We seem to have lost Kristen. She's still there. Maybe she just turned off her screen. I don't know if anyone from the panel's got any final remarks, any closing statements?
Actually, I'd like to say that I really love ECC. I'm really glad to see that it's been running for so many years, and it's such a successful conference workshop. And it's unfortunate we have to do it virtually this time, but hopefully things will go back to normal at some point. But keep doing ECC. It's an awesome meeting.
Great.
Thanks,
All right.
Anne. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, and I'm going to remind everyone that the next panel starts in 6 hours' time. I will be asleep, but some of you will be awake. There's already nighttime where Dan is. He might be awake again already in 6 hours. But anyway, next panel in 6 hours, and then there's 2 more panels after that on subsequent days. And I also draw your attention to the fact that there's some kind of virtual coffee room on WonderMe. So we'll see you all there in a few moments. So thank you all.
Bye.